With Chapter 7, we're going to talk about the issues surrounding juveniles being transferred into the adult court. At the end of the chapter, you should be able to explain the differences in maturity between juveniles and adults, to explain how transfer to the adult court takes place, as well as the different types of waivers. We touched a little bit on waivers in Chapter 7. To summarize blended sentencing and different blending sentencing models and how they can become complicated very quickly. Describe what intermediate correctional system for juveniles would be like. Discuss the death penalty for juveniles, and then also to be able to summarize the debate of juveniles receiving a sentence of life without parole. So let's look just a little bit about the differences in maturity between juveniles and adults. Maturity is really a psychological term, and it indicates when a person responds to circumstances and an environment in an appropriate manner. You've probably heard people say, oh, they're very mature for their age, or they're very immature for their age. At what point an individual starts responding in an appropriate manner to their environment when they don't get something that they want, or can they delay gratification? Those are all signs of maturity. And trying to determine when a juvenile should be held responsible for their actions, we take maturity into consideration and make it part of that determination. How mature is a 7-year-old mature enough to know the consequences of their actions? Because we don't have an objective tool to determine when childhood ends and adulthood begins, this is where the juvenile justice system struggles with defining responsibility, and struggles with at what point should a juvenile be transferred to the adult system. Here are some arguments for and against juveniles' diminished responsibility. Juveniles are responsible, essentially those in mid-adolescence, because one, they do know right from wrong. They have a developed and social conscience. They feel guilt or remorse. They're mentally sharp enough to understand and know the rules. They do not have any disease reducing their ability to get along in society. They understand their actions when they harm others, and they are emotionally mature. Arguments of why they lack the maturity is that they are substantially different from adults in moral, cognitive, and social development. They're particularly different in cognitive decision-making from adults when they have a low average intelligence. They are different from adults when they have learning disabilities. And they may not understand the language of a Miranda warning well enough to make that a valid waiver. Think about your typical 6, 7, 8-year-old. If they are told you have the right to remain silent, but a police officer asks them the question, a particular question, and says you have to tell me the answer, do they have the cognitive understanding to know that they have the right to say, I don't want to talk to you? Is that level there? Another argument is they often make choices in terms of plea bargaining that reflect compliance with authority, as well as psychological immaturity. Children are more likely to be people pleasers, to feel that they have to bow down to authority, right or wrong. And so some feel that juveniles have diminished responsibility for that reason alone. So let's talk about how a transfer takes place. If we do feel this child is mature enough to understand the difference between right and wrong, what they have done, it can take place with a waiver. Because of the concern over violent juvenile offenders, states have passed laws that allow juveniles to transfer to an adult court through different methods that we call waivers. And these children could be sent to an adult prison. So this procedure is a very serious issue. And the severity of offense and the juvenile's record are probably two of the most important factors in the decision to transfer a child into the juvenile court. So here's some different types of waivers, and we touched on these in the last chapter. There are judicial waivers, waivers made by the judge. Okay, the court makes those decisions or the prosecutor can make the decision. I mentioned that one last time. There's statutorial or legislative exclusion. This is statutes that dictate or laws that dictate. And then we can have a reversed waiver and blended sentencing. Okay. So some state laws permit youths who are over the maximum age to be sent back to the juvenile court. A blended sentence involves a juvenile disposition and an adult sentence, and we're going to talk about that here next. The whole idea of this blended sentencing, and it can get complicated pretty quickly. You can have a juvenile exclusive blend, and this is an example is New Mexico, where the juvenile court has original jurisdiction and responsibility for adjudication of the case. The juvenile court has the authority to impose a sanction involving either the juvenile or the adult correctional system. So the juvenile court can add on an adult correctional sentence. Juvenile inclusive blends is the juvenile court has original jurisdiction and responsibility for adjudication of the case. Juvenile court has the authority to impose a sanction involving both the juvenile and adult system. In most cases, the adult sanction is suspended unless there is a violation. And at that point, if they do violate, then they do have to go into the adult system. And you can see the states to the right that have that. There's juvenile contiguous. This is the juvenile court has the original jurisdiction. Okay, they have the authority to impose a sanction that would be enforced beyond the age of the extended jurisdiction. Okay. At that point, there are procedures that are invoked to determine if the remainder of that sanction should be imposed in the adult correctional system. So before they go into the adult system, there are procedures that are put in place that will determine if they should actually move over into the adult system. Then you have the criminal exclusive blend, and this is where the court tries the case. The criminal court has the authority to impose a sanction involving either the juvenile or the adult correctional system. Okay, so the criminal court makes that decision, not the juvenile court in the examples above. The juvenile exclusive blend up at the very top of this slide, this is the criminal exclusive blend where the criminal court gets to make that decision. And then you have the criminal inclusive blend. You'll see Missouri falls into this example. This is where the criminal court tries the case. The court has the authority to impose a sanction involving both the juvenile and the adult correctional system. In most instances, not all, but in most, the adult system is suspended unless there's a violation, and then at that point it is invoked. So like I said, it can get very complicated very quickly. Lots of different combinations there to consider. Next, let's talk a little bit about intermediate correctional systems for juveniles, and what does that mean? It's really a transitional system between the juvenile and the adult system. So it's a little more strenuous than the juvenile's system, but it's not as harsh as the adult system. It can take the form of a disposition where the juvenile is given one last chance of success in the juvenile justice system, and they have the threat of adult sanctions as a deterrent if they reoffend. So, one idea that's used. Let's talk a little bit about the death penalty for juveniles. Death penalty, most would agree, is the most severe sentence for anyone. And the courts have struggled historically with whether we can execute juveniles who commit particularly heinous crimes. In 1976, Gregg v. Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty did not violate the Eighth Amendment. It did state, however, that lower courts should consider special circumstances of the offender, and those circumstances included age and circumstances of the crime. There are very few executions of juveniles that have been carried out. And in 1985, Wilkins v. Missouri, the Missouri court sentenced Wilkins to death, and the Missouri Supreme Court upheld the decision. However, Wilkinson had not been executed by the time Roper v. Simmons was handed down. In 2005, Roper v. Simmons determined that no juveniles who committed their crimes under the age of 18 can be executed. So even though Wilkinson v. Missouri, the Missouri court said he could be, and the Supreme Court upheld that decision, he had not been executed in 2005. So Roper v. Simmons determined that no juveniles who've committed crimes under the age of 18 can be put to death. So the next debate, makes sense, is the debate about sentencing without parole, life without parole. In 2010, the Supreme Court ruled that juveniles cannot be sentenced to life without parole for any crime short of homicide. Okay. At some point, the question we ask is, should juveniles be given a chance to show that they should be released? If someone commits a crime at 16, are we saying they have to live their entire life in prison, and no point in between there should they be able to show that they have matured, that they have changed their way of thinking, and that they should be released? Life in prison without parole for juveniles gives no sense of fulfillment outside of the prison. There's no chance for reconciliation, therefore no hope and no incentive for the juvenile to become a responsible adult, is the debate that is ongoing. So to summarize, again, as you go through and you study, make sure that you are very comfortable with these 6 objectives for this chapter, and you should be prepared for your quiz and the exam.